Salima had roamed the streets at this ungodly hour enough times to know that the city never really slept. Footfalls, laughter, and screams echoed through the dark alleyways as though coming from a great distance. They never failed to put her on edge. The mosque would soon call for the Fajr prayer, so most men were probably getting ready to head to the mosque. Salima walked faster, winding her way through the maze of streets and narrowing alleys. It was that brief part of the night where the air felt refreshing and the cool wind soothed her left cheek where that bastard had slapped her. Come to think of it, she was in a lot of pain. The back of her head was throbbing from being slammed against the column. Her throat was tight and she felt sore between her thighs where he had grabbed her. The palm of her right hand burnt from the coal.
Tourists know it as the City of Joy. For Ouled Nayil dancers, Bousaada is a city of horrors. It is 1931 when two sisters arrive in Bousaada, bursting with dreams of becoming successful dancers. But the city, occupied by the ruthless French colonial army, changes their lives forever. When they kill a soldier in self-defense, Fahima and Salima must outsmart the French colonel, who will stop at nothing to uncover the truth.
There was one question she could no longer avoid. She hadn't meant to kill the man, but could she have avoided the whole fight? He was intent on killing her in the end. She could see it in his eyes, all that rage. She also knew that if she hadn't resisted, he would have raped her. She knew he was a killer. She had just passed the gates when a man's howl started her to a stop. It was the adhan for Fajr prayer. The sun would soon rise, and with it went any chance of getting rid of the body in complete discretion. Clutching her malfa, she crossed the marketplace as it slowly came back to life. A carriage stall was installed where Salima had danced last night, before making her way to Mouloud's cafe. She had always found it amusing that one space could turn from a large dance party in the evening to a quaint marketplace in the morning, and every once in a while, a place of worship too. Today, there was nothing quaint about the scene. Every stall and every person she encountered felt like damnation. She quickened her step.
The sisters are driven further into a cycle of violence with every attempt to hide their crime. Risking their lives and the lives of their loved ones, the dancers find themselves at the heart of a civilizational clash. 10 Roses is a tale of resistance, sisterhood, and the shameful past of two colliding nations. The idea for 10 Roses started in, I think, 2016 when I was doing a year-long fellowship in the States at Pennsylvania State University. And I was taking a creative writing course. And so I like to believe that sort of my brain and my mind was like wired to pick up stories wherever I looked, because I had written for so long, but I think I had stopped writing while I was working on my thesis and really busy with work. But that was the time when I was starting to pick up, I was writing a few short stories and I was writing a lot in English. And then one day I was procrastinating. I was supposed to be doing a paper for a class I was taking. And then procrastinating, I stumbled upon this podcast by a French historian who was I think the podcast was prostitution in Algeria specifically during the Ottoman and the French colonial periods. And for me, it was like, what? Why is somebody talking about that? And how come we've never really heard about these conversations? And so, of course, I went to listen, to the podcast. And just in passing, she mentioned that, the whole business was different in Algiers from other places. Like the Ouled Nayil dancers in Bousaada. She also talked about how the whole sort of culture was different, and to me that sparked a big sort of curiosity, because then I had to go research, like, what do you mean the whole prostitution was different in Bousaada, and what do you mean, this happened all during the colonial times, but also before. So I went and did a lot more research, and then the more I dug, the more information I found about how this was a culture that was unique to some tribes there, but also about the whole difference between sort of like North Africa, but also mostly anywhere outside of Europe, because, in Europe there's the whole modern sort of definition, but then outside of Europe it's all about courtesans, people you pay for the company, not necessarily for bodily pleasures. And so how also you have these women who were raised since childhood, they were raised to dance and entertain and sing, and so when they grow up, there will be a mother or sister or a cousin who would walk her to town, because they would be in tribes outside of the city. But then somebody from the family member would actually accompany this dancer at the age of 13 or 14 to Bousaada, to the city, or there's also other cities nearby too. And then, to introduce her to cafes where she would be dancing, to sort of like the house where she would be staying, and then sort of just introduce her to the entire network. And so for me, that was, again, I was like, what do you mean about this? Like, this is in Algeria, we've never heard about this. And part of me was frustrated, like, as an adult, I had never heard about this story before. Why are we talking about this in history books? And then also, like, there was more fascination with, like, their jewelry and how these women would wear their entire wealth, which made them victims, and how they protected themselves using some of these bracelets. And I think the spark for the novel really was when I was reading about these conflicts between this culture and then the soldiers, because Bousaada was a city with a military presence from the French occupation, and so these were men who were looking for quick pleasure, and they didn't understand how the local culture worked. These people, the dancers are used to tourists who are usually there to pay for the entire entertainment. And so this whole conflict and some of the fights actually took place, and there was a fire at one point. I was like, well, that makes a really good sort of conflict and makes a really good plot.
When Salima had first come to Bousaada 4 years earlier, her dream had been to become a successful Nailiya dancer. But she had known all along that it'd only be a phase. That the ultimate goal was to collect a dowry before going back home to get married and start a family. Her mother had done that, and so did every Nailiya dancer. Some foolish girls like her naive sister dreamt bigger. They wanted to travel to big cities, their dreams feeding on false stories, myths, as Salima liked to call them, of dancers who made it to Algiers, Paris, or Rome. They danced for royalties and lived luxurious lives. Salima's hopes were more realistic. For the last year or so, she had started to feel content. Her sister and she had rented their own house, and they planned to hire the best dancers in town to start the house. They would be the house tourists sought when they came to town. This had always been Mother's dream. Things had also gotten serious with Murad. He was a strong, nice, and caring man. Her marrying him was simply a matter of when, not if. So, if he had asked her to get out just a week ago, she would have said yes. But now, with everything going on, she couldn't bring herself to say yes. She couldn't leave her sister alone to deal with the whole chaos she had created. She could maybe convince her sister to get out as well. But their skip in town would be all the proof that was needed, if proof was needed in the first place. It would only be a matter of days before the Qaid and his nasty snitches would find them and drag them all the way back to Bousaada and throw them at the feet of Colonel Dupont. They might even kill Murad and a score of villagers in the process just to trade their ears for money. How could she agree to leave with Murad, knowing it might bring all this misery on the people around her? What seemed even more daunting at the moment was having to explain to Murad why she couldn't leave. She couldn't just tell him she had killed a Frenchman. but she couldn't think of any other good reason to stay here either.
So these dancers would travel. I think there were a lot of events, starting with the big fair in Paris. I think, was it 1890 or 1889, something like that, where, the fair during which they built the Eiffel Tower. And there are a lot of subsequent fairs where, it was to, part of the big show to bring indigenous populations from different places of the world, and they would try to recreate their, villages. It was a bit sad because I think when you look at some of those pictures and descriptions of how, also even like the ads, I remember seeing a caricature of sort of like almost like a zoo, in a way that they bring indigenous people, put them in these sort of closed spaces, trying to recreate their natural habitat, which is a terrible way of saying it. Part of that was also bringing these Ouled Nayil dancers, and of course these are performers, so they would be performing on the street. A few years later, there was the Chicago Fair of 1893, I think, and I was reading this book, The Devil in the White City, and then there's numerous references to, they call them the Algerian dancers, and so these are Ouled Nayil dancers who traveled, and there's this whole funny thing about how they got the dates mixed up, so they arrived a year before they were supposed to. They're like the right month, but a year before. And then there was somebody there who put them to work, I think, performing and working and sort of basically making a profit out of that. But then there's also like, they became such a big part of the whole preparation for the fair. You remember at one point, even when they did the whole, the Ferris wheel, when they tried to launch it, big part of the festivities was the dancers making music and dancing around it. And then you read a lot of blogs and articles, and there's even like paintings and pictures from that time, from that interaction between the Algerian dancers and the whole Chicago community there. And there's a lot of other sort of like instances where they traveled mostly to France because of the French occupation, but also there's the famous circus, Cirque Ammar, which was owned by I think an Algerian who had inherited from his Italian father-in-law. And so he would take a lot of these dancers on tours, especially in Italy and other parts of Europe. And big part of the show was the Ouled Nayil dancers. But there was a lot of really exciting accounts about their time in Chicago because they spent more than a year there. They were in this street where there were also dancers, belly dancers from Egypt, and then also they were the Algerian dancers. And so how there was a little bit of influence on some of the, the local people who wanted to, also take the performance. There were girls who were like, escaping their home and going to learn to be belly dancers or like, Ouled Nayil dancers.
Fahima tried to hurry, but she was soon distracted by the largest and loudest group of them all. Half of them were Europeans, and their clapping and shouting threatened to overwhelm the fast-paced music. Dust rose in a thick cloud around them as they tapped their feet in excitement. At the center of the circle was a dancing figure. With her hands above her head, she swayed her arms in mesmerizing loops, while her belly rose and fell rhythmically with each drumbeat. Her legs moved freely as if each had an independent life. Yet the anklet on her foot swerved in circles, always complementing the beat of her hips. Fahima stood still. She was enchanted by the music and dancing, and how the performer dazzled everyone around her. She wore a bright red dress embroidered in gold, with fluffy sleeves and a large girdle right below her breasts. The big golden rose adorning the belt must have cost her months of work. A grey silk veil around the dancer's head covered most of her black hair, except for two thick plaits that looped around her ears and lolled to her shoulders. Two black ostrich feathers decorated the veil and brushed the air as her head swayed right and left. Another veil, striped in beige and white, was tied around her waist and cascaded almost to her ankles, leaving an opening through which she revealed the length of her leg. Layers of coins covered her chest and forehead, clinking and dancing to their own music. Even her olive skin danced in harmony with her body, the fire casting shadows across her perfect face. Her full lips in a slight smile, her thin nose and her large gazelle eyes ringed by thick eyeliner. She was like the legendary dancers from the stories. In her plain brown dress covered in layers of dust, Fahima felt like a beggar. Now that she saw a dancer for the first time, she wondered if she would ever enjoy a moment like this, if people would ever gather to admire her as she performed a breathtaking dance, if she would ever stop young girls in their tracks.
And there's just one character also was very fun to write about, was Hizia, who's sort of like half myth, half real. I think I say in the book how she sort of has always danced in the fantasies of Algerian historians and writers and poets, just the same way it does with Fahima, our character, and her sister Farida. Everybody dreams to be like her because there's so many stories. Who was she? Was she a dancer? Was she really successful? There was this whole love story involving her, and so I think a lot of people actually think that she existed, but some other people would say no, there is a lot of people, and then sort of they were all grouped under one character as sort of like an urban myth, and her name is Hizia. So I was sure to also refer to her, and sort of like she represents the dreams of Fahima. She wants to she wants to travel like her. She wants to have like a romantic life. She wants to Fahima is like that as a character. She's easily fascinated by bigger world, as opposed to Salima, who's she wants the dowry, she wants the money, she wants to go back and start a family, marry a husband. Fahima dreams big, and she wants the painting, she wants to travel, she wants to go on a circus. And so Hizia represents all of those dreams to her. And so for me, it was also fun to weave her details in the dreams of those girls.
How far back does that mythology of Hizia go?
Mostly in the 1900s. I think it goes back to the early 1900s. I would say there's also mention of her, so in the 1800s, like people talking about her in the 1800s. But really, I think she falls in that period where the tribe, and also like a lot of people were we call them the Ouled Nayil were mostly semi-nomadic, so they traveled a big portion of the year basically in the hot weather. They would go all the way up north, and then they spend the winter in the south, and they go back to their own village. They're not always sort of nomadic, they are semi-nomadic. And so Hizia's tribe would travel all the way to another city. And so people try to also pinpoint some of the times based on the sort of like those cycles of the nomadic travel. But as far as I know, I don't know a specific time for her. That's why I think also she's half myth, half real in a way.
Every time she used the oil lamp, Fahima felt excited. She had never used one before coming to Bousaada. It was small things like this that made her grateful for being here. She wondered what joys lay hidden in bigger cities. Fahima removed her jewellery and placed it gently inside a wooden chest. She took a moment to admire the small collection she had earned after months of hard work. She had danced every night until her feet hurt and occasionally given stinky men pleasure. She wasn't complaining, of course. Things had started to change once she sold her virginity. She still cringed whenever she thought about that awful night, but time had dulled the pain. Time and experience with clients that Dahman and Hada had brought for her and her sister over the weeks. The job hadn't gotten any easier, but she had gotten used to it. Nevertheless, Fahima was glad to be dancing at cafes. Of course, she wasn't dancing at any prominent ones yet, but since she had started dancing at Dahman's, other cafe owners were easier to approach. The competition between these old men worked in her favour. For now, she and her sister made enough money to pay for rent, dresses and jewellery, and they even spared some money for their mother to take home to their family back in the village. She dreamt of rising higher, performing Algiers or Paris, a circus in Rome. Who knew? San Roses is largely about Ouled Nayil, a culture that has been virtually lost. Why do you think that was so forgotten?
When I was doing research for San Roses, the first thing that I noticed was, if you come across any, video or picture or painting online, and you read through the comments section, you'd have an avalanche of sort of commenters going like, oh, this isn't true, this did not exist, this was the product, the product of the colonial powers, this was the French trying to tarnish the reputation of the Algerian people. And so like they were in complete denial. And then there is the whole other point of view where, I read some PhD thesis or some articles from people trying to understand the Ouled Nayil culture, but they were almost in a apologetic way, almost going to say, like trying to justify their existence, saying like, it was poverty, it was the circumstances, these people had no other choice but to go and dance because, they were living in poverty because of the French colonization. But then, interestingly, when I talked to people from Bousaada, so like there were two historians that I talked to, and actually, there were a couple of friends that I know who happened to be from Bousaada, and so like, having those conversations with these people, my friends also talk to their parents and their grandparents, and they, the people never deny the existence of the Nayil culture, and just because, especially the older generation, they remember a time when these people were still working and dancing around Bousaada and attracting tourists. And what happened when I was reading through the history, so what happened is, after the 60s, Bousaada continued to attract a lot of tourists all throughout the 80s. But then there was also a lot of efforts to integrate them with the local community. So like through agriculture, there was a whole agrarian revolution going on in the 60s and 70s. And then eventually also, the security situation in Algeria deteriorated throughout the 90s. And so basically the late 80s was the last that we saw of a lot of the tourists that used to come here and all throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And so there was much work for these women. So they had to, all the families together, so they had to go into agriculture, other sectors. And so very quickly, I think they were forgotten about, understandably, because, this isn't something that people would be very proud of saying, But I think if you dig enough, you will find a lot of records of their existence, like I said, especially through visual documentation. And for me, it's important to revisit that part of history, not just to, it's not sort of like for a scandalous reason, but mostly to, to be able to know our history for real and be able to have those conversations around that. Because also there's a lot of lessons to learn. These were women with a lot of, financial independence. These were almost matriarchal societies. And so it was a completely different culture from even Algeria where they live, but also from other parts of the world. And so there's a lot of lessons for humanity to draw from this experience. For me, it was really important when writing Senrose that these women are not, it was important for me not to portray this in an apologetic way. And that's why, it's important for them to have dreams and objectives in life, and, for them to want to either get married or start a family, but also if they want to travel and have, to have that kind of like aspiration to be successful dancers. And then, we at one point we do compare sort of like the different communities. And really, I think we're trying to do is like, these were different, and for me also it's just not fair for this culture to carry the weight of the entire nation and the reputation of the entire nation. These were just women who were not thinking about like anything besides their life, day-to-day life, but also like their own dreams of becoming successful dancers. So like for me, it's important not to be apologetic, but it's important to highlight the difference that this culture carried from the rest of the country, at least.
Maybe it's a different group each time, Nuara continued. Everyone knows we carry our wealth on us. They don't need to break into any house. All they need to do is corner a weak little girl with a chest full of jewellery. Fahima could almost feel her gold necklace snap against the back of her neck. If she didn't have her coins, she would have nothing. Aren't you scared, Nuara? Fahima had to ask. Of course I am, but fear won't save me. Each year dozens of girls get robbed. Some get injured or murdered. They were probably all scared to death, but that didn't keep them safe. I say you need to be prepared. If they attack you, be ready to fight back. Know that they're there for the money and they wouldn't hesitate to kill. To them, we're just trash. If you scream for help, no one will bother to save you. You'll have to take matters into your own hands. Nuara's tone had changed. She was no longer trying to scare them. They needed protection. How? Fahima asked, unable to fathom how a woman could face a group of ruthless bandits. These men are secretly cowards. If they'd been any braver, they wouldn't resort to lurking in dark corners waiting for a girl with coins. All you need to do is show them you are not afraid to die. You need to always carry a weapon with you and be ready to use it. Here's mine. Nuara lifted her hands. Bracelets covered her forearms all the way to her elbows. Thick rings dotted her fingers, and a golden snake coiled around her upper arm. She rotated a thick bracelet on her right wrist. The silver bracelet had intricate triangles and lines and circles and some zigzags too. Fahima was surprised to see 4 short studs sticking out. The tiny spikes had dull heads, but the side edges were perfectly sharp. "This looks like a harmless decoration, yeah?" Nuara said, "but it's lethal." Nuara slid the bracelet down to the heel of her hand and swished her arm in front of her. "You can dig those spikes into a man's neck," she added as she rotated her hand in circles. Below those pretty features and the skilled dancing, Nuara was hardened. Like now, in a rare moment when she wasn't smiling, you could see some weariness in her eyes, some practiced numbness. "You only need to attack once," Nuara was still explaining as they emerged onto the street of joy. "You don't even need to kill them. Just one serious blow with confidence is enough to show your attackers that you are not afraid. Et voila, they'll escape as quickly as they appeared." Entangled in Nuara's mystery, they'd followed her like children following the adventures of a hero. But the band of dancers had to separate. Nuara threw one last warning in Fahima's direction. "Again, I'd watch out for my jewelry if I were you."
I think one of the fascinating things about this culture is how it had developed in a way where, for example, at the beginning, these are women who danced for money. And so at the beginning, they would collect some of the money, but then there was no bank at the time. They couldn't leave it back home because it wasn't safe, because it's a house with probably a lot of other women and somebody else might steal their money. So they had to keep all of their wealth on themselves. And so one way to do it was they started to put these coin necklaces. So these are sort of like basically you put a hole through the coin, and then you pass the sort of like the string through it, and then before you know it, you have like a ring of coins around your neck, and then with time you would have more and more rings of coins, and sort of like it covers all of your chest and your belly as well. Or sometimes they would use it to buy, like bracelets and other necklaces and other jewelry. But eventually what happened is these girls would be wearing their entire wealth on themselves at all times. And then it also became a show of success. So the more jewelry you have, the bigger the coin necklace, the more successful you are. Versus if you're just getting started, you probably have just a few coins or maybe just a few bracelets. But also they became sort of a target for thieves and other criminals, and especially these women who would work at night. They'll be walking back home, in the middle of the night. So they were easily moving targets. So there were a lot of records of women being attacked at night, their jewelry being stolen. Especially you have a lot of tourists who come from out of town. They would, they'd have a good time, take some jewelry and run off. And so they had to develop a way to defend themselves. And so one way they did it was through the spiked bracelets. You had these bracelets with spikes coming out of the sides. And so that was one way, if somebody attacked you, you're able to sort of hit somebody on the neck. And so all throughout the book, we have lots of scenes where the girls use them, or they talk about using the bracelets to defend themselves. And then how if you hit this certain spot in the neck, it might cause so much bleeding and it might give you a chance to run away with your life.
She suddenly felt an urge to get out of here, to go back to her village where no one got murdered for money and jewelry. She would lead a simple life with her family without having to be afraid at night. She didn't see why she had to stay here and work anyways, if each time she collected a small sum of money, someone would rip it off her neck and maybe kill her while they were at it. With her heart still as heavy, she stood up and brushed the dirt off her dress. "Thank you," she said to the pile of sand, and she turned to leave. She had only walked a few steps when she glimpsed a robust woman walking briskly towards her. Salima didn't believe it at first, but it was her mother. Salima hadn't seen her in months. "Here," Sadia said as soon as she was within earshot. "You'll need this for protection." Skipping the kissing and greeting, Saadia took Salima's hand and placed a bracelet in it. It was a silver piece with intricate carvings of large flowers and small rhombi and other shapes Salima couldn't make out. What stood out to her, though, were the spikes. 5 short but sharp studs on the outside of the bracelet, like the menacing teeth of a lion's snarl. "I got one for your sister too," Saadia added, while Salima turned the decorative weapon in her hand. I need you to wear it at all times. If someone tries to as much as touch you, you plant those spikes in his neck until he bleeds to death. You hear me? Don't let anyone hurt you, Saadia ordered. Salima nodded as she slipped the bracelet on her right hand, then turned it around her wrist, feeling the cold silver against her skin. As mother and daughter returned to the city of horrors, Salima didn't wonder if she was ever going to have to use this weapon. She wondered how soon. What she should have wondered was how many times she would drive that bracelet into a man's throat, how many times she'd watch a man die. Characters. Alexandra the painter.
A big part of the research for the Ouled Nayil culture, and I mention this a lot, is found in the imagery and the visual representation more than sort of like documentation. Like, you know, like if you go read up on for example, the pharaohs, you know, who were thousands of years ago, you'd find a lot more articles and books and commentaries. If you look for proof or like any documentation on the Ouled Nayil, you find them in visual documentation mostly. So we're talking pictures, we're talking videos, we're talking even sort of like some sculptures, but mostly paintings, because there are a lot of people who would go there. Etienne was a big one, you know, who would go live in the community, and they would be painting all the scenery around them. So like they have, you know, like they would be describing the locals, you know, as they're praying, a market, a store, even some religious sort of events. You know, I remember Etienne painting where he was describing, I think, these men sort of trying to see the moon at the eve of Ramadan or Eid. So some really specific sceneries from the local culture. And I think what was really fascinating about him is, you know, he was a French painter who went and lived for years in Bousaada. And so he painted everything around him. And then at what stage he even converted to Islam. And then so you see also how at the beginning he was fascinated by the girls, by the dancers, even had some nude paintings that are pretty hard to find these days. Then he developed a little bit more and he grew a little bit more fascinated with the local culture, with the traditions, with the religion, and then he converted to Islam. And so it was mostly about that. He even wrote a novel with a friend of his about, I think it's called Khadra, about the Ouled Nayil dancers. And so our character, Alexandre, in Seine Roses, he's so much the embodiment of that whole integration. So like he's someone who's after the local community, he wants to be part of them. You can even see him sort of like, you know, he lives in the French part of town, but it's behind the hotel that's starting to look a little bit like so he lives like in limbo between the French and the Algerian communities. And you can also see that how, you know, like he's a bit hesitant to help the colonel because, you know, he feels like he's betraying we don't say all of that, but that's those going on in my head. Like, this is someone who's a bit reluctant to help the French against the Algerians. But then also the colonel sees him as an asset because this is a French person who's integrated the community, he understands the community, he will be able to hear the news and the information that the colonel isn't able to get his hands on. And so that's why he's really frustrated. He's like, why isn't this guy helping his fellow citizens? There's, you know, French soldiers who are dying. He should be helping us. He shouldn't be helping them. A short corridor led to his studio, a small parlor with large windows that flooded the space with sunlight. More canvases at different stages of completion hung on walls, lay on the floor, and stood in corners. Joseph spied the painting of an old man sitting at his doorstep, looking at Joseph miserably. In another corner, a group of young girls danced merrily in a cloud of dust. A woman stood in nothing but silver anklets, staring defiantly at something in the distance. Her small breast stood perkily, and a patch of thick hair covered her private part. But the painting didn't look complete. The background was still a sandy brown, and the colors weren't very bright. After that, Joseph saw nothing but nakedness. A group of women bathing in the river, a man and a woman lying in bed together, another woman sitting on puffy cushions. Joseph wondered if painters were just sick people who disguised their unconventional lusts in the form of artistic inspiration. He couldn't believe all those Arabs had sat, stood, or lain still for hours at a time while Alexandre traced the intricate details of their bodies. But then Arabs had done much worse for him in exchange for 10 francs. "I'm almost done with this one," Alexandre interrupted Joseph's thoughts. He pointed to a canvas that stood on an old wooden easel. A young Arab man in a white linen suit holding a hat. The figure was complete with smooth dark skin and dimples on his cheeks, but the background still needed some work. "Who's your model?" "Someone from Biskra," Alexandre shrugged. "He's here for a few days and I offered him bed and board in return."
How long did it take to write Sand Roses?
When I came back a few months later to Algeria, I think by then I had developed an entire outline. And so it took me at least a few weeks, maybe a few months to develop an outline. But it was really consistent, a really long, maybe 14-pager of an outline. Because then I had been doing a lot of research and compiling some, real life incidents and some of the things about the tribes and the dancers. So just the plot line was a few weeks or a few months. But then it took me 2 years to complete the writing. And I always say that I think it took me 18 months to write 20%, and then I wrote 80% in 6 months because the whole process changed towards the end. But also at the beginning, just the research took so much of it because, I think this is a completely different culture, different environment. We're not really familiar with it. So everything I had to, at every sentence I had to stop and make sure it was historically accurate. So did they turn on the light? Was there electricity in the city? Did they had to search? Or, were these women aware of, were they able to speak, about time? Can they say, I'll meet you at 3 o'clock versus I'll meet you at sunset? Every single thing would stop me and do some research. But then I think once I went past that 20%, I was able to establish my world, my characters, and then also was able to really commit to a consistent process. Then for 6 months, I finished the rest of the 80%. I took a lot of online courses and watched lots of videos from, published authors about their process and stuff. And I think I found a lot of these tips helpful, write what you know about and the process, just writing whatever comes to mind and then worry about the editing later. But also, I think a big one that I really appreciate is what they tell you to protect the process. Choose a process that worked for you, that's regular, that's frequent, and then protect it no matter what. And that's what I try to do. I was glad that I was able to commit to that process where, I would show up at least 3 or 4 times a week, 5 in the morning, spend 2 hours writing. And that got me in that groove because then, if I start the next day, I won't spend an hour going what did I stop? What did I mean by this character? Because I think by the end, by the time I'm done with, the first session, I know what I'm going to start the next day. So I just, fire up the computer and just start typing away. But also it would keep me, during those times when I'm not writing, I'm always thinking about that scene, what's going to happen, and the conflict in it. And I think that really helped the writing process, as opposed to at the beginning where it was okay, I'm just going to write whenever I have the time or whenever I'm in the mood, which, if you commit to 3 hours once a week, it takes you maybe half that time to just put yourself back in the mood and in the groove. When talking about things that worked out, I think for me, the beta reading feedback was extremely helpful because I think, there's a lot of things that you think sound a certain way and then you get somebody to read it and then, either they're confusing or, they sound confusing or they sound probably they need, they're probably boring or... I think especially writing from a point of view of a woman is extremely hard. So that's why I had quite a few of my friends, female friends, read it, and then they came back with some real feedback. Somebody said, "Say, there's no way a woman would do something like that or would think something like that." Then that's not how it works. But also I think not just from an emotional point of view, but also from I think just a thought process. And then sometimes we'd have big arguments and say a mother would never do something like that to her kid, but we have proof that this happened not just in this culture, different cultures. But I think some of those conversations and fights were very helpful to share.
What were the linguistic differences when writing in English?
So that's a very good question. I think all of that, when you add layer of English, because yes, Bousaada at the time was known as the city of joy. Bousaada in Arabic means joy or happiness. It's a very convenient 4-hour drive from Algiers, and so it was a typical weekend destination for French people, but also like tourists coming from outside of Algeria. If anybody's stay in Algiers, it would be a very good stopover to go there, because then it's just 4 hours away, but it's the closest desert town, and so people can have the full desert experience, go on camel rides and go camping, but also see the exotic at the time there were exotic dancers, and so that creates a really rich interplay of cultures, because you have the dancers on one hand, you have the locals who are a different culture, and you got the French, and you got the tourists who are coming from all over the place, and trying to capture all of that in English, which probably was not the language that everybody was speaking. Mostly everybody was speaking probably Darija, Algerian Darija, or French. I think the challenge for me was the language, but also how do you make it come across without making it sound archaic or too modern. You don't want Fahima to sound like a valley girl from LA. I think that would be a bit disturbing. But also, I was trying to get some of the local notions, and so what I try to use a lot is some of the imageries. So you see a lot of people thinking, if they have an experience, they think, this is like being in a sandstorm. Or, for example, this is like trying to, for example, hold sand in your hand, or they're referring to the palm trees, to the to the jewelry, to the moon, things around them that are noticed like that. I try to weave a lot of that local context and environment through their heads, but also I think there was even a challenge of what are their, I don't want to say cognitive abilities, but what kind of thought process is going in their heads. Would these women who lived in the 1930s, who had no education, would they be able to have, a conversation, for example, again, like we said, for example, would they be able to talk about time? For me, direction was are they going to be using right and left, east and west? Or are they going to be able to use north? Because north and south isn't such a common notion here. Even now, if you're walking in Algeria, nobody's going to say you go north. They probably will say go right, go left, or some places on the east or the west. The north and south are not the commonly used directions, as opposed to, for example, an English-speaking country. And then it was easier for me, to be honest, to have a inner dialogue, inside dialogue, or even to write a chapter from the point of view of the colonel, French colonel, because I felt like this is somebody who would be educated, who would be well-read, and he would be able to have a conversation at a higher sort of cognitive level than Fahima or Salima, who I thought would have a completely different thought process from what we know today. A fun thing to write was the swear words. Fun as in really difficult, because they, at one stage, I think I had lots and lots of thinking about, these are women who had to be aggressive, who had to defend themselves a lot, and so they probably were a bit vulgar, and that had to translate through the language. And so also question, what kind of swear words are you going to use? Are you going to use the modern American swear word, or are you going to use a traditional one? And then the more I thought about it, the more it's a lot of them are just translations, and then you'd be using the same words. There's even, I think, when I tried to establish that at the beginning, we even have one of the girls telling this really vulgar story about, I think, a woman in her wedding night, and just to establish these are women who are who had to use vulgarity as a way to to look like they're strong and to defend themselves in almost an aggressive way. And I think I had that idea from some of the. I remember there was a snippet of an audio from one of the fairs in France, and then you hear the Ouled Nayil, there's a woman talking. I honestly could not tell what she was saying, because I think the clarity of the voice, but what you can tell is she was being very aggressive in the way that she was talking. So from there I was I have to try to portray that in a way that's, that doesn't make people hate her, but also it has to reflect the reality of the time.
To a degree, or if you had translated an ancient or early swear words, would it be anything like?
I thought about that, and I did think if you translate, especially if you translate any swears from Darja, there's two ways. There's two ways of I think there's if you could say maybe the British and the American way. The American way would be sort of to use sort of obscene sort of sexual terms, the F word, but also sort of parts of the body and stuff like that. And I think I used a lot of that heavily. The other option would have been now is they use sort of religious obscenities, and so somebody would curse your dad's religion, which sounded a bit almost comical to me. That's why I didn't use a lot of that. Somebody swearing in Darja would be somebody saying I curse your mother's religion, or I curse your mother's God. It didn't translate too well. I steered away from that.
Do you remember the first complete story you ever wrote?
Vaguely. I think it was one of those those children's books styles, A4 folded in half. And what I remember is a scene about this, I think, princess going in a carriage through the woods, as all Renaissance scenes would have princesses do. And of course they were attacked by some thieves who were trying to kidnap the princess. What I remember being interesting thing about it is I don't know, maybe I wasn't so familiar with the point of view, but this was not a story from the point of view of the princess. I don't know if it was from one of the guards or maybe the thieves. I remember watching the whole thing unfold from telling the whole story from the outside more than the inside of what's going on. The inside of the carriage. And so I remember that story sort of I wrote it from beginning to end. But the one scene that's striking for me is that scene in the middle of the forest when she's being kidnapped. So that would be, I think I would have probably been 8 or 9 back then. Yeah.
What are you working on now? What's your next project?
So without spoiling too much, by the end of when I was working on Santa Rosa, by the end I was coming to this conclusion that there's a few characters here who would make a really good sequel. And so I am now currently working on a sequel for Santa Rosa's set 20 years. Yeah, it's exciting. So the sequel is set 20 years later, 1950s in Algiers, during one of the most impactful periods of the country, which was the Battle of Algiers. I mean, there was a war of independence going on around the country, but especially 56, 57 is where the Battle of Algiers was going. And if anybody's familiar with Algerian history, probably would know the movie, the Battle of Algiers, which was a really sort of intense period where the fighters for independence were bringing the war to the city, and so there's this huge clash against the colonial army. And of course, wherever there is a clash and conflict, I find a very good potential for a good story. And so what we do is, we see some of the characters from Santa Rosa's move to Algiers 20 years later, and they find themselves in the middle of this, again, another civilizational clash, I think, between these two countries, these two armies fighting, so Algeria fighting for independence. But I think what I find most interesting about this sequel is sort of it's focused on this character who's also struggling with a few identity issues. Who is she? What does this war mean to her? She's sort of she grew up between Algerian side and the French side, and so she has allegiances on both ends. And for me, that makes a really exciting sort of way to explore also a lot of the ethical issues and the moral topics that were at a time there. The French people supporting the Algerian Revolution, the Algerians debating the question of bringing the war to the city, and I think that creates a really exciting setting for a story like that.